without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Kamali. Dr. Mohammad Hashim Kamali is a professor and a founding chairman and CEO of the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies in Malaysia. He has held various academic leadership, faculty positions at numerous higher education institutions around the world. He has addressed over 170 national and international conferences and has published 20 books and over 160 academic articles, mashallah. And if I may say, many of his articles are on my reading list for my courses, as I know many of you have studied them and taught them. So Professor Dr. Kamali, without further ado, please go ahead.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Shuruq, for your kind introduction. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. My presentation is about the Maqasid, history in jurisprudence of Maqasid, a critical appraisal. I will be beginning the discussion with the reference to the Quran and Sunnah in the place of the Maqasid therein. Then a reference to the major contributors to Maqasid, marginalization of the Maqasid by Usul al-Fiqh through our history, then a revival of the Maqasid in the 1980s, conditions, the types of Maqasid, and a few other points of methodology. Now to begin with the reference to the Quran. The Quran is typically purpose-oriented. We read many references to the priorities of Islam. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ, with reference to the prophethood of Muhammad. The purpose of your mission is to bring mercy and compassion. And then with reference to the Quran, فِيهِ شِفَاءٌ وَهُدًى وَرَحْمَةً. This is the purpose of the Quran explaining. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains his own purpose. يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ. Then with reference to qisas, with reference to jihad, with sadaqah, with tahara, in all of these we find references to the purposes of the ahkam of the Quran. And this is the reality of the text in the scripture. And yet, through our history, the Maqasid have been neglected. The methodology of ijtihad, the Usul al-Fiqh, which expounds the methodology of ijtihad, has been dominated not by the Maqasid, but by the formulas of Usul al-Fiqh, Qiyas and Istihsan and Istislah, and a number of other principles. When you compare them to the Maqasid, the relevance of those to the living issues of the people, like protection of life, protection of family, protection of property, is somewhat indirect. And this may be also the reason for the revival of the Maqasid. The Usul al-Fiqh has not really served the purposes of legislation and decision-making very well. And it is rather backward-looking. That is why there is a fresh attention to the Maqasid. The reason for their marginalization has been the kind of circumspection on the part of the fuqaha. They usually look at the text, the letter, the meaning in their textualist kind of position, in their textualist outlook on Islam is different when you come to the Maqasid. The Maqasid doesn't look at the meaning of the letter and the word, but the purposes of the ahkam. And this is something that the fuqaha did not encourage. There is a story by Al-Misawi saying that a PhD student who had the word Maqasid in the title of his doctoral dissertation in 1960. The examination committee forced him to delete the word Maqasid, and instead they replaced it with Ahdaf. This was the kind of the fiqh fuqaha attitude, circumspection about the Maqasid. Their position was that the attitude of a Muslim should be to listen to the ahkam and submit to it and follow it, not to ask what is the purpose of that and what was the purpose of the other. So these were the kind of the outlooks that suppressed the Maqasid through history. The Jumhur looked toward the Usul al-Fiqh, not the Maqasid. The Zahiris, on the other hand, said that we do not recognize the Maqasid unless the text clearly tells us that this is the Maqsad. And the Shia also said the Maqasid are known to their Imam, the Batiniya similarly. So generally the history of Islamic thought was not encouraging of the Maqasid, yet there were scholars who paid attention to it, like from the 4th century, Al-Tirmizi al-Hakim, he started using word Maqasid. Then Al-Juwayni, the teacher of Al-Ghazali, he divided the Maqasid into these 3 types, Daruri, Haji, and Tahsini, the essential Maqasid, complementary Maqasid, and the embellishments. Then Al-Ghazali has a disciple, Al-Juwayni's disciple, Imam Al-Ghazali, the famous Al-Ghazali, he identified the Maqasid Daruri, the essential Maqasid, to be 5: protection of religion, protection of life, protection of rationality or intellect, family, and property. And then Al-Shatibi came, and he was the major contributor to the Maqasid in his work Al-Muwafaqat. He opened the Maqasid into a new chapter of the Sharia. Then scholars like Al-Amidi, he recognized Maqasid as a basis of preference, al-tarjih. Al-Qarafi, the Maliki jurist Al-Qarafi, added a new Maqsad number 6, which is the protection of personal honor or ird. Izzuddin Abdul Salam, the author of Maqasid al-Ahkam fi Masalih al-Anam, he came up with the conclusion that the whole of the Sharia and all of the Maqasid are geared to human welfare. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in no need of Maqasid or Maslaha. Sharia is entirely geared for people's welfare. Then we have this, after the history of neglect, only in the 1980s that we have a renewed interest shown in the Maqasid, and then the revival of the Maqasid ever since has been continuing into 4 or 5 different phases. The first phase was exploratory and historical. People started looking at the history of the ideas, and then at the epistemology in the second stage, the theory of the Maqasid, definition, and the types of Maqasid and how they are identified. And then in phase 3, the Maqasid were taken as criteria of evaluation, that the existing interpretation, when they contrasted, did not correspond with the Maqasid. They were identified and corrected. And then the 4th phase, we come to the latest phase, is the interest that is being shown in the implementation of Maqasid. Like we have seen Maqasid in governance, in Islamic banking, in finance, even education, in information technology. Questions are being asked in Islamic banking and finance, for example, that they apply the rules of fiqh, but forgetting the purposes of those rules. Because everything that we see in Islamic banking and finance in the names of fiqh, the purpose is to just find another way to riba. This has made the Muslim customers in Malaysia and elsewhere suspicious of Islamic banking and finance, and there was the need, therefore, to bring the Maqasid, the purposes of fiqh, what are those, and they should play a role in the transaction. Yet, Maqasid also do not have a jurisprudence of their own. They show you the way how to apply the fiqh, but they do not replace the fiqh. When you say Maqasid Daruri, Maqasid Haji, Maqasid Tahsini to a banker, the banker doesn't know what to make of this. And therefore, Maqasid also doesn't come theoretical in the implementation. There is a lot of talk about it, but there is the way is not shown how the Maqasid should be applied in Islamic banking and finance. For example, one way of making this implementation meaningful, purposeful would be that the banking transaction, the Islamic banking transaction, proceeds over a number of contracts. Mudaraba, Musharaka, Murabaha, Baya Mu'ajjal, and so on. Maybe one can identify the purposes of these contracts and then tell the bankers to then apply these purposes and see, and that will be the kind of guided implementation to the Maqasid. And then we have another phase in the revival of Maqasid, which is somewhat negative. This is the kind of excessive usage of Maqasid. Everyone who likes the word throws it in and without really knowing much. And this is something that it has caused a bit of a problem and confusion on the part of the people who do not know the subject. The reason for the revival of the Maqasid is that the Usul al-Fiqh are failing to respond to the needs of legislation and decision-making. How should the Maqasid actually relate to the Usul al-Fiqh? The Usul al-Fiqh is very rich with the methodology of ijtihad. The Maqasid is purpose-oriented but does not have its own methodology. It is obvious that the two should complement one another. The Usul al-Fiqh and the Maqasid should complement one another. This is the view of Abdullah bin Bayya, al-Qaradawi, and others, but Ibn Ashur, Tahir ibn Ashur, al-Raisuni, and one or two others, they believe that Maqasid have developed well enough now to become the basis of ijtihad by themselves without depending on Usul al-Fiqh. I think personally that Al-Shatibi, the master architect of the Maqasid, did not really see it. When he wrote the book Al-Muwafaqat, Maqasid is the 4th volume, the other 3 is on Usul al-Fiqh. And therefore this idea of separation between the Maqasid and Usul al-Fiqh and leaving Maqasid, the Usul behind and taking Maqasid as the basis of ijtihad, and this is not generally accepted, and I also not support it. Now, Maqasid, we said, are in 3 varieties. Initially, Daruri, Haji, Tahsini. Maqasid Daruri are the essential Maqasid. These are indispensable for normal life in society, for the individual, like we talking about protection of life, of property, of religion, and so on. Without these, normal life will collapse. The Maqasid Haji or complementary Maqasid, without them, there will be some hardship, some difficulty. Like the Sharia grants a number of concessions, whether in fasting, in salat, in transactions, and so on. These concessions are meant to make people's life easy, but they can live without them. And then the third variety of maqasid, that is tahsini or embellishment, they really follow these two categories. Daruri, they can improve. You may be like salat is one of the maqsad zaruri. You can perform the salat in a rough and rushed way, or you perform it in a way that every part is done in a way that the desirable aspects, the tahsini part, becomes part of the daruri and bring beauty to it. And this can be said nowadays. Actually, a great deal of the daruri in the haji in society, in people's life, has been really obtained. And there is a greater scope for the maqasid tahsini, like protection of the environment. It is maybe not, maybe it's maqsad zaruri when it comes to the essential primary question, but maybe for the rest of it, it is maqsad haji. So the maqasid, these three types, relate to all aspects of life. And they are practical proposition, not theoretical kind of. Then the maqasid also are divided into other varieties, maqasid amma and maqasid khassa. When we speak of maqasid amma, we speak of the whole of the Sharia, like principle like justice, prevention of hardship, prevention of harm. These are maqasid amma, relate to the whole of the Sharia. Whereas maqasid khassa, some aspects of the Sharia, family law, criminal law, and so on, maqasid khassa relates to these aspects, parts of the Sharia. Then another classification of maqasid is maqasid qat'iyya and maqasid zanniya. Definitive maqasid are those that are established in the clear proof. This may be the Quran, the Sunnah, or Al-Shatibi's method, istiqra. This is inductive reasoning. There may be numerous references in the Quran to something without declaring that this is one of the maqasid. When you put them all together, by induction, you identify that this is a maqsad. There is so many references in the Quran to charity, to protection of the orphan, to honoring your parents, and so on. There is so much emphasis, although this doesn't declare it as a maqsad, but these are the maqasid. And Al-Shatibi even says that the division of maqasid into these three types, daruri, haji, tahsini, this is also the result of induction, of istiqra, inductive reasoning. And then two other classes of maqasid. One is the maqasid of al-shari', the other maqasid of mukallaf. Maqasid al-shari' are those that are identified by the Sharia. In maqasid of the mukallaf, that people identify for themselves. Like the purpose of knowledge, for example, from the viewpoint of the lawgiver, is the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his creation, The purpose of knowledge is to know him and to know his religion. The purpose of knowledge for a mukallaf may be to get an education and to get an employment. So these are the kind of purposes. And lastly, maqasid asliya, maqasid tabiyya, the normative original purposes, and then the subsidiary purposes. The original purpose of marriage is procreation of the human species. The subsidiary purpose may be companionship for elderly people. They do not procreate. This may be companionship, friendship. Then we have how are the maqasid identified? These are identified, as I have already said, by the clear text or by an indication, by istiqra. But when you look at the text also, you look at some of the signs, like some ahkam has greater benefit, some ahkam, the benefit is repeated in different places. There is a promise of reward. There is some of the maqasid that the Prophet and his companions, they have acted upon it. When you look at these, you identify the value, the kind of prioritization of the maqasid, that these are, these command a higher priority. And istiqra, which is the third method of identifying the maqasid, not only identify the maqasid, but the awamir and the ahkam of the sharia, the awamir in the nawahi and the commands and prohibitions of sharia can also be identified by inductive method, by istiqra. The maqasid should also fulfill 4 conditions in order to be a valid maqsad. It must be sabit yaqini, not disputed matter, but there is clear proof in its support. It must be zahir. This is Ibn Ashur's 4 condition. A maqsad must be evident. If need be, it can be proven. It's not a hidden factor. A maqsad should be am. It is not partisan or confined to particular individuals. And a maqsad must be tarb. It must be exclusive. Applies to what is supposed to apply and excludes what is not supposed to be applying to. Then the scope of the maqasid, the last 1 or 2 points that I will discuss. We have seen so much interest in the maqasid. And the scope of the maqasid has also been expanding. We have seen the maqasid being identified in science and technology, in information technology, in contracts and others. The question has been asked, should the maqasid be confined to these maqasid daruri, haji, tahsini, and the kind of traditional typologies, or should we also recognize new maqasid? Ibn Taymiyyah has addressed this question, and he said, look at the Quran. There are so many other values and purposes, fulfillment of contracts, for example, truth, telling truth, trustworthiness, amana, and commitment to the family, giving their nafaqah. All of these are the maqasid and these are the ahkam. It's not confined to those 3 types or 4 types. So the ulama began to add new maqasid, Al-Qaradawi added justice, human dignity, and social support, al-takaful al-ijtimai. I have added, for example, world peace. Without peace, all of these other maqasid cannot really be fulfilled. And even science, research and science and technology are indeed the dignity and standing of the Ummah in the world community depends on it. And nowadays, maybe protection of the environment, good governance. These are also when we can identify these as the contemporary maqasid, because there is evidence for it, for peace as one of the maqasid, protection of the environment. We can find support for the just government. We can find support in the text, or otherwise in rationality, in istiqra. Then ijtihad maqasidi, my last point. The point has been made that the usul al-fiqh has actually narrowed down the ways, the methods of istinbat and methods of extraction of the ahkam to qiyas, to one or two other things, whereas this istinbat should not be confined to analogy, but it should be like the hifz al-aql, for example. In the traditional text, protection of the mind, the typical example, for example, is given is not to drink intoxicant. Well, this is one thing, but the question has been asked, should we not make the same hifz al-aql the basis, for example, of the prohibition of all these corrupt customary practices, for example, superstitions, like amulets, and like seeking medication from all sorts of questionable methods that really is not in compliance with the dignity of hifz al-aql. And therefore, the scope of istinbat, the scope of ijtihad maqasidi should be wider than the kind of ijtihad that has been identified by the usul al-fiqh. The maqasid in usul al-fiqh, finally, we both are part of our heritage, and they should be complementing and supporting one another, but we need to look beyond the usul typology and relate the maqasid to the priorities of life in other areas. I will stop here and give time to others. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much, Professor Kamali, for this fascinating presentation, and it inaugurates our workshop aptly and appropriately with the right kinds of questions. I'm very wary of time, so Dr. Anjum, would you like to say how we are adjusting the program in order to compensate for the lost time due to technical issues?
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Kamali. This was fascinating and really wide-ranging, and we will have, I hope that you can join us for the next 3 days when a number of young scholars, and really bright and brilliant, I'm very happy with the papers that we have received and that we're going to be hearing next 3 days. Hope you're here to engage them and guide them, but also appreciate that they are much more critical, and they're really down in the trenches asking questions of whether Maqasid can work. So I think that we'll have fascinating discussion. And we had initially planned, Dr. Sharouk and myself, to do a 20-minute presentation each to give our view on this. symposium and then called for papers of use of Maqasid, if you will, use and abuse of Maqasid. But we realized that because we've lost those 40 minutes and your talk was the most important one, and the next most important thing is those participants who have joined us and who are there as attendees. So we will skip our 40 minutes and we'll incorporate them later, inshallah, in the seminar tomorrow and the day after, and then the day after that. But for now, I think we'll proceed immediately to questions. And can those attendees, are you able to unmute yourself? If you aren't, we will have you write your questions in question and answers, and I'll read them out. Okay, great. So, any questions? Please raise your hands and I'll call your names. Well, I guess if people are feeling shy, I have a few questions that I can start with. But we have Dr. Asim Fadela, we have your question. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Hashim Kamali, for your talk. I have a question about the social imagination and how that is wedded to Maqasid, right? So we talked about today the particulars and mechanics of where they might fit and the explanation of what they look like. But can you comment on the social imaginary that was embedded or should be embedded within defining, conceptualizing what the Maqasid are?
Can you, I didn't quite get your question.
So my question is about the conceptualization of the Maqasid themselves and how they should or should not be wedded to certain social imaginaries, right? So you might say Ibn Ashur's model is 5 centuries or 4 centuries after Ibn Shatibi's model, and today Sheikh al-Adawi's model is different. So how do we maintain or not maintain, and how do we evaluate these social constructions that are embedded within the Maqasid, either in the classical or traditional views or the more modern ones? Where would they fit in? Most of the time we spent, the most of the time we spent on talking about the classification of Maqasid, Daruri, Haji, Khas, Am, but not about how the social construction of what the goals are embedded within their definition.
Well, the history of ideas is valuable. Civilization are constructed or not over time, overnight. We value the heritage and we take it. This is what we have been doing. The Maqasid before the 1980s were understood in one way, and since then we are constructing new additions to it. We retain some, we may be throwing out some of the outmoded aspects of the Maqasid, but there are certain aspects to ideas that are time sensitive in age. Others are substantive ideas. When you say that the Maqasid are in 3 types, Daruri, Haji, that can apply today or can apply at any particular time. What social imagination, the way people relate to one another, and the kind of the dimensions of taught in communication, in knowledge, they differ. And the idea in the Maqasid themselves is that we should be following the purposes of events. What happens in our time, in our life, we should identify that with a good sense, with a good purpose, and construct our way ahead on that basis. We do not really advise to stay with the old ideas. We have been renewing it, and that is what we would advise.
All right, David Drennan, please go ahead.
Hi there. I had a quick question. I found it very interesting that you noted that you kind of agreed with Shatibi in that Maqasid was not separate to Usul al-Fiqh itself. So I was just wondering, like, my interest is actually kind of like the relationship between the heritage and social change and so forth. So I was just wondering, how do you see the tension between Maqasid and, as you're just talking about, developing Maqasid in the contemporary period, how do you see the tension between that and the actual textual heritage itself?
Yeah, the tension is not, the tension was between the Usul al-Fiqh and the Maqasid. The Usul al-Fiqh was dragging us behind. And the reason why the Maqasid invited our attention and sparkled our interest to depart from this kind of fixation on Usul al-Fiqh and go in a different direction in order to make our ijtihad more purposeful and not tied to analogy and to this and that. We brought the Maqasid. The Maqasid themselves are not internally, kind of, there is no internal tension in the Maqasid because the Maqasid does not have a kind of a methodology of its own like the Usul al-Fiqh. It doesn't have internal formulas like you have istihsan, like you have qiyas, or you have sadd al-zarai. The Usul al-Fiqh has them, but the Maqasid does not have those internal ideas. It is the purpose, it tells you for everything you do, look at the purpose of what you're doing and inform yourself by that purpose rather than following the letter, the meaning, the interpretation, the literal meaning, like we have been doing for so long. So this is the new direction that we are taking. I don't see that this will be internally tension laden. It is quite dynamic and it can relate to the realities of our time and age.
Yusuf Sufi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Kamali. My question's a short one. I'm curious about the fact that the Maqasid have become prominent in modern times specifically. It strikes me that if the Usul al-Fiqh is not doing the trick for the derivation of the law today, while it did in the past, perhaps the problem is less with the Usul al-Fiqh and more with the way that it's used today. I'm curious if you have some ideas about this.
Yes, well, I mentioned that the Maqasid, or people talk about it a lot. There is a great deal of interest being shown in implementing the Maqasid. But when you actually come to implementation, you are going back to fiqh and you are implementing the fiqh, and albeit you implement it in a more purposeful way, but you are not finding some new reality. The same I said in Islamic banking and finance. People talk about it, that the maqasid, but what do you make of the maqasid? I say that the maqasid are theoretical. They did not give us the best way of how to implement them. I tell you, the maqasid zaruri or haji or tahsini of Islamic banking and finance transactions. I give you these three terms and I give you a few contracts. What you make of it? It is not easy to implement the maqasid just by repeating it. I'm saying that if you are methodical about applying, implementing the maqasid in Islamic banking and finance, then ask the question next, what does it consist of? The banking and finance consists of transactions that proceed over a number of contracts. These contracts, 5, 6, 7 contracts, muraha, mudaraba, musharaka, bay mu'ajjal, identify the primary purpose of each of these, maybe also secondary purpose of each of these. And then tell your banker that this is the purpose and apply this. Then you have put your finger on something. But otherwise, to mention and keep saying maqasid of this and that, and you don't have a proper kind of approach how to implement it, it doesn't going to work out. This is something that is theoretical about. It's not like the usul al-fiqh. The usul al-fiqh has its own substance, methodology. The maqasid is just the manner of doing things, not like it doesn't give you the rule of the law. The rule of the law is still the fiqh. And the maqasid just tells you, like if you are a company director, the maqasid will be good for you to tell you that put the essential first, the secondary after that. And this is the order of priority. But it doesn't give you a new formula or fiqh, so to speak, to apply. And therefore, when we come to the fourth phase, in the which is the implementation of the maqasid, I say this is very much work in progress in every area, whether it is information technology, whether it is education, whether it is government, whether it is any other field, and you are about to apply the maqasid, identify the maqasid, find the best way of implementing it and go about it that way. But not just, sort of throwing the word without working the details out. So these are the kind of uncertainties we have not yet really, I'm making it maybe a little more difficult than it should be in real life. In real life, we have purposes, we make decisions, we go about our purposes, and we are not really looking at the books of jurisprudence in front of us, or the theory of the maqasid. There is a simple side to maqasid, and there is this more, a methodical conflict when you come to kind of transactions and contracts, and then information technology and science and so on, and you find to you identify the maqasid and apply them through the maqasid. This is something it works out the kind of details. Okay, need to be worked out.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharouk, and then Dr. Sami Al-Dagestani.
Yes, Thank you, Dr. Anjum. I hope I'm not abusing my position as co-host here by asking a question before the other participants, but it's a follow-up question, a methodological one. And it's about what you said. It was inspired by your admitting that there are uncertainties in the way the Maqasid is being fleshed out or being used as a discourse at the moment. So you clearly say that it is not an usul. It doesn't have its methodical framework as of yet. But isn't this the reason as to why it has become attractive and popular? It's because it dilutes the link to the text that the fiqh creates by making it possible to perhaps push the frontier of the fiqh in ways that the usul won't allow for. So perhaps the wider question is, in the context of secular modernity, are we using the maqasid in order to overcome the groundedness in the text that is creating some tensions, but without interrogating secular modernity and its demands upon us, but rather trying to find a solution, an adaptive solution from within? I hope this is not too long-winded, but yeah, I look forward to hear your answer.
Methodology remains a weak aspect of the Maqasid, but this has been developing. The reason I give so much detail about the types of Maqasid, about the kind of how you identify, how do you prioritize, how many types, each one of them has its own characteristics and so on, to tell you that in 20th century, and so even since the 1980s, the methodology of Maqasid has also been developing. We do not have Maqasid as enriched with methodology as we have the usul al-fiqh. We are not having that, but we are not now in the same position like we were half a century ago. Like people like the scholars have been trying to work out, like people like Al-Rasuni has written a book, one or two others have written, Tahir ibn Ashur has written an impressive book. We have been doing works, and these are developing, and it helps to tell the average man how to go about the Maqasid, about the varieties of Maqasid, about the accuracy with the Maqasid, the kind of those details. I explained some, but we are not talking of usul al-fiqh. We still have a weakness with regard to the methodology of the Maqasid, but maybe an advantage of the Maqasid is that it is to some extent a common sense idea. It's not like the usul al-fiqh that throws you off your balance. It's a kind of, everyone can make some sense of the idea of the Maqasid, and they, apply it as a formula in their everyday life. We do, but when it comes to the kind of the more complex application of the Maqasid, there you have to have methodology. You have to have how to the way of how to go about it, and not just to be mentioning Maqasid all the time without working your way out. I hope I'm not repeating myself. Your question was a little, some aspect of it I didn't quite grasp, but maybe you can say it again if you like.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was helpful. I'll come back if there are no more questions, but give others a chance now.
Inshallah. Sami al-Dagestani, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for your lecture, Dr. Kamali. You spoke a little bit about usul al-fiqh and maqasid, and I'm also interested about the epistemological relationship between the two on one hand, and also between maslaha, specifically in ethics, on the other. And my understanding is that maqasid, obviously is not an independent from the legal scholarship, and similar can be said for ijtihad as not being exclusively a legal concept. As for maslaha, more specifically, thinking of the legal as being derived from the moral, how accurate is it then to claim that maqasid and by extension maslaha are in essence ethical concepts that are theorized within the moral law?
Yes, masalih and maqasid are often used synonymously. The usul al-fiqh scholars, they did not make much difference, distinguish between them. But there is, I have drawn a distinction in my writing between the masalih and the maqasid. Maslaha, the end result of the, the maqasid are also after, as I earlier mentioned that Izzuddin Abdul Salam, he in his book made the point that all the maqasid and the ahkam of the Sharia in their maqasid, the sum total is human welfare. This is the basic idea that is shared between the masalih and the maqasid. But maqasid has a degree of permanence, of a firmer foothold in the Sharia. Maslaha is utilitarian. It is, both are subject to value judgment a little. The reason being that both of them are not, they do not have this kind of accurate methodology that we can prevent value judgment in their application. Maslaha and maqasid are to some extent open to that. We do not have the methodological accuracy for them. But I say there is a distinction because the maqasid are based as the maqasid zaruri, haji, tahsini, zaruri, tied to those zaruriyat, life, faith, religion, so on. And they are all based in the clear text of the Quran and Hadith, or by istiqra, based in the clear text. The masalih are not always that. One type of maslaha, which is the maslaha mu'tabara. The masalih mursala, maslaha mursala, unregulated. Maslaha is just loose. It's not tied to a text. It is utilitarian. Whereas maslaha mu'tabara is that which is related to a text. It has a textual grounding. But otherwise, the maqasid has a degree of kind of stability and permanence that masalih may be lacking. But the kind of the end result in both is not very far from one another. I'm not sure whether I answered your question or you have.
Well, thank you very much. I know it's late there for you, and after many questions that we all begin to sound the same, but I think you're doing extremely well. Thank you very much for putting up with us. There is a question in the chat. Could one say that the maqasid is a kind of malaka that the jurist embodies rather than being a separate framework?
The kind of malaka?
Right. Is it just a kind of extra sense that a jurist has of what the law is trying to do that is already embodied in the usul al-fiqh-based reasoning, if I understood the question correctly?
Well, when you look at the, maybe that is perhaps an understanding, Maqasid, that is what is all about. When the jurist is purposeful with what he's doing, he is a Maqasid oriented. But when you look at the jurisprudential aspect of the Maqasid, when you say Maqasid Daruri in Haji or Tahsini, these are more than just Malaka. They have external, identification. The ulama have identified it, Al-Shatibi has identified it. And these are, when you mention these five, Al-Ghazali identified that the Ruwiyat are five. Al-Qarafi said there is one more, and maybe Al-Qaradawi add one more, and then it becomes Ibn Taymiyyah says something else. They are inspired by the similar thinking, but they are also trying to give it an external kind of manifestation that you and I can look at it and make sense of it and what it is. It's not just the jurist thought, but it's for, it is becoming part of, it is a part of our Islamic juristic thought. And it has kind of an aspect that everyone can look at it and apply it and learn from it, not just the jurist in his own private thinking, so to speak.
Okay, very interesting. So you're suggesting that when Maqasid becomes a public discourse of the jurists, it becomes more disciplined.
That's right. Yes.
I
And
wonder,
that's what we have been doing in the last 40, 50 years,
right,
to give it that aspect.
right. There's another question, Rosina Raja, that what knowledge is other than usul al-fiqh are necessary to develop good Maqasid methodology? That's a great question. Pedagogically, how do you develop? How do you know what the Maqasid are?
What is necessary to develop the Maqasid methodology?
Right.
Is it necessary?
No. So the question is, what other knowledge should a scholar, a jurist have apart from fiqh and usul al-fiqh, the traditional stuff, in order to develop a Maqasid framework?
Or what other knowledge? What we are talking of all kinds of knowledge. It can be criminal law, it can be jurisprudence, it can be information technology, it can be science, it can be any branch and area of knowledge that lends itself to this analysis. Does it have a purpose? And does it have an identifiable purpose? So the Maqasid is not tied to one area of knowledge or another. Maqasid can relate to all area or any area of knowledge where purpose identification is a reasonable approach. Maqasid therefore has a kind of versatility that is lacking in usul al-fiqh, in the sense, and maybe that is one of the attraction of the Maqasid to modern generation, that it can relate to different areas of learning, different kind of activities and occupations. It can be any area of knowledge, so long as you are well informed about the details of the Maqasid, that the Maqasid are not just kind of open value judgment. They are related to the text, they are related to istiqra, they are related to the primary maqasid, the lawgiver's maqasid, and those aspects of the knowledge or the, you might say that the methodology of maqasid need to be kept in mind, but it can relate to different areas of knowledge.
All right. If I could ask a couple of questions, or rather one, with a couple of different aspects, my own. It seems to me that there is usually an assumption that maqasid is going to lead to improvement and liberation and progress, liberation from the limits of taqlid or limits of law in the past that's outdated. But why is it not considered that maqasid, because as you very eloquently said a number of times, that it doesn't have a method of its own, and of course method has an advantage that it cannot be abused, right? That's the purpose of having a method, is that it creates a public sort of imperative that everybody can recognize as opposed to subjective judgment. But maqasid is necessarily, even if we can recognize the label that we all need to protect religion and life and so on, but its actual concretization is somewhat of a value judgment. Other than, if it's not a value judgment, then it is just the law, in which case, what's the point of maqasid? But if it is a value judgment, and if my assumption is correct, then why do we not worry that this could become a tool in the hands of authoritarian governments or bodies of elite who are trying to accumulate wealth and power for themselves? As the Arab countries today, for example, have demonstrated that that's precisely what they want to do. It seems that the great advantage of the historical tradition of madahib was that it had developed this authority of with time, so that it allowed the jurists, the powerless jurists, otherwise socially, politically powerless jurists, to wield the authority of a great tradition vis-a-vis even governments. But it seems that maqasid gives that power potentially for the highest bidder, or to the highest bidder.
All right, well, the advantage that maqasid brings is that it informs you of, draws your attention to the purposes of what you are doing. A lot of people, they do things without really identifying clearly what are the purposes, the ultimate consequences, the ma'alat al-afal, the kind of kind of awareness that is generated by the maqasid. It does help to integration. It does help to knowledge development. It does help with the kind of, if you are, we are criticizing the tafsir of the Quran nowadays. Why? To some extent, because this is not, it does not integrate the maqasid. It just looking it to the words of the text and meaning of the text, but does not tell us about the purposes. So you have informed in that aspect of the very existing knowledge, the tafsir of the Quran that has, exists in dozens and dozens and very large bulks and volumes. And yet we are now beginning to write. Why don't we write a maqasidi tafsir? So we are reaching now a stage of a better, a more advanced stage of knowledge in that area. And that can be extended to other fields of science and knowledge. What we have now, as I said, one of the phases of the development, recent development of Maqasid in the third phase was that it is being used as an evaluative principle, a criteria of evaluation. What has been done in a way that does not serve its own purpose very well. In a lot of the interpretations that whether it is the Quran or the Hadith or the Fiqh and so on, that are not purpose, it does not lead to its own purpose. That kind of is part of the integration of knowledge, part of the quest that we ought to be doing, and hopefully that it will be a valuable occupation. And it is not, it's not really, that is an abuse of the Maqasid to be open value judgment and in the hands of, the misguided and make something, unwanted of the Maqasid. But when it is applied in a purposeful way, it is a big contribution to knowledge. I think that, yes, there is this possibility of abuse, and it is one of those areas. Maslaha has been one, and Maqasid is another, and I don't think that the Usul al-Fiqh is that much open to abuse, but you can say Maslaha is also part of the Usul al-Fiqh. You can also maybe twist other formulas of Usul, like you can twist Qiyas even, you can Al-Sadd al-Zara'i, even use it to the extent that you really block the way to good things. Those abuses are possible, but I think Maqasid and Maslaha is a little more open to it. But we are developing, we are aware of it, and we are developing better understanding of it and better methods of applying the Maqasid to different areas of knowledge.
Thank you very much. Dr. Shuru, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kamali. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and for all those who ask questions, it has been a wonderful start for hopefully a very fruitful conversation. And the beauty of this workshop, as I see it, is that we're going to have a few days to mull over the questions, so it's not too intense over a period of 2 days. I know you have waited patiently, and I thank you again for waiting, everyone. And I just want to say on the technical issues, please try to log in tomorrow, 9:45, so 9:45. Is that correct, Huda? In order to test that all the technical matters are running smoothly. Many thanks again. And one of the last questions has been a question about the power, the structures of power through which the discourse of Maqasid is being through which it's being inflected. And I think that's an interesting question to carry with us as all the others. And I'm certainly interested in it because it was part of the talk that I didn't give today. Thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow, inshallah. Dr. Rawaimer, do you want to add anything?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.